Shields and swords, feel the wars, fighting my blood down to the core. Warriors from medieval age, fear the reign of night brigades. Crusades into the room, moving through the temples and tombs. Scared and placed, prepare to face Professor Awesome and the minions of doom. 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 Professor Awesome and the minions of doom.
One issue that very often comes up and has come up for centuries of thinking about literature is the question about which is more important, the universal in literature or the particular in literature. Now, and I think not only do different people fall onto different positions in that, but through time, I think the scholarly community has sort of swung back and forth on the issue. The question about, is this work of literature great because it is great for all time across cultures? Or is a work of literature great because it speaks to a particular time, a particular circumstance, a particular thing? And I think the answer is not one or the other, nor even both, but simultaneously both connected to one another, that they are both part of the same thing. And what do I mean by that? Well, I think there is no doubt that there are some stories and some kinds of literature that has a kind of universal appeal. A good example of this would be the filmmaker Kurosawa, being really enamored with American Western movies, decides he's going to make his own kind of Western. And so he makes The Seven Samurai and sets it there. And then, of course, Americans, not realizing this is what he'd wanted to do, they see The Seven Samurai and say, wow, this would be a great Western. And then they adapt that back into a Western with The Magnificent Seven. And so between these two adaptations, you can kind of see the universality of this idea of a small group of reluctant heroes who gather together, and each one is motivated by different things, but ultimately they become heroic because they defend the defenseless. And that story as a story seems pretty universal. It seems like the kind of thing that people will always want to hear. My main specialty is medieval literature. Well, not only do I not live in the Middle Ages, but we're really dealing with cultures that are far away across the ocean from where I live. I do very, very little that would be contemporary with the Middle Ages in the Americas. Very little survives, and that which survives is difficult to teach, difficult to study. So you have to imagine there must be some universality. If that thing still speaks to me, then there must be something universal in that. Flip side of this, of course, is the question of particularity, because surely there are some works of art which just are not well translated into other cultures, or even sometimes other times. Comedy, comic arts. Very often it's difficult to take something funny and make it funny in another culture. This doesn't mean that it's not great. Sometimes something is great because it speaks to a particular moment. And sometimes that greatness cannot be understood by someone unless they understand the cultural context that we're talking about. And so, I think that there's good evidence to suggest that the universal is important for some literature and the particular is important for other literature. However, in the end, I think that stories get at universal truths through their particulars. What do I mean by that? Well, let's take some old story that I might know about. Okay, so let's take, for example, the Epic of Gilgamesh. The Epic of Gilgamesh is set a long, long, long time ago in a city I have personally never been to. The main character is a king who's partially a god. I'm neither of those things. He has a series of adventures, and then he goes off seeking immortality, discovers he cannot have immortality, loses his best friend, and then decides, well, if I can't be immortal, I will just be a good king. And then in becoming a good king, he becomes quite famous and praised. Well, what does the Epic of Gilgamesh then have to say to me? In the particulars, it seems like nothing. But the Epic of Gilgamesh does deal with universal things that do appeal to me. I know what it's like to want to build something. I know what it's like to lose someone that you care about. I know what it's like to desire immortality. Right? I have those universal experiences, even though I've never had them in the particulars of Gilgamesh. And the same is true for almost any work of literature. Like, even if I have never experienced those particulars, I can connect to the universals. This is why I think it's very dangerous and foolish for someone to say, well, you cannot understand this work of literature because you do not fit into some particular identity group that's connected with this. This is foolishness. Because, first of all, I don't fit into the identity group of any of the literature that I typically teach. I'm off by at least a millennium for most of it. And aside from that, if it doesn't in some way evoke the universal, well then, what's left? Why is it literature? Why is it great? Because I know what it's like to be disappointed. And when I read of someone who has a completely different life than me, who has sometimes imaginary situations or situations that are far separated from me in space or time, then I can experience that with them because I am a human like they are. And I experience their lives as well. Well then, am I coming down firmly on the side of the universal? Absolutely not. Because we also need those particulars. We need those particulars. We need to understand the situation itself. And sometimes we need particulars that actually get at a situation that is very familiar to us, one that cuts very close to home. Right? So to give you an opposite example, there used to be a television program, and the television program was called Good versus Evil. And I mentioned this show to a friend. I said, have you seen this show, Good versus Evil? And he said something like, well, isn't that every show? The problem with the title was it suggested something that's so universal that it lacked particulars. Right? And you've been there where someone is telling a story, and the story they're telling, they're giving you the broad strokes, but because you don't have the details, you can't actually feel it. The story doesn't mean anything to you. And so even if you don't share those particulars from your own life, you need those particulars so that you can experience the new situation. And so this is really what I'm getting at with the idea of arguing that you have to be, that great literature both works in the universal and in the particular. It is universal because it must tie into experiences that we've already had, broad universal experiences, the experiences of wanting to be loved, the experience of being bored, the experience of being afraid, the experience of elation. Whatever we have these universals, it needs to be able to tap into those for us so that we understand them. But it also needs the particulars, because I need to not just be reminded of those, I need to re-enter into those, but not in my own life, because the author usually won't know who I am, couldn't guess anything about me. Instead, the author is laying out a character who's experiencing those in their particulars, and now I am leaving in some way myself and entering into that character's life and experiencing that same thing with them, experiencing it again. And so because of that, I think the debate about, well, does literature need to be universal or does it need to be particular, is, I think, a little silly and misses the point. Great literature takes the universal experiences and has us relive them through the particulars.